My name is Michael Giannacco. I'm from the far west side of Los Angeles, and happy to be here. Thank you all for allowing us an opportunity to present before this audience. We see a lot of familiar faces out in the audience, and I want to echo some of what Christian, Luis, and President Rummel have said, which is that to the degree that our report offers insights, makes findings, offers recommendations, they were all built upon certainly our experience, but to a large degree, to the degree that these recommendations are intended to be tailored to this community and to the Madison Police Department, we wouldn't have been able to do that effectively were it not for the receptiveness of those of you who agreed to speak with us, those of you who agreed to provide your insights, your perspectives, and those of you who also identified other individuals, organizations, and provided us an entree into those organizations and folks during our process. The process took a year. I think the RFP was wise to recognize it could take a year, and it gave us some space and some time to really dig into the public outreach component. We know policing, but we don't know Madison and didn't know Madison in January of last year when we first got started. And you all, to the degree that this report it has now been completed, it contains bits and pieces of all of you in that report, because those insights came from you. We don't name names, we don't identify individuals, that's not how we roll. But don't want it to go unsaid that this report really is was a town effort. It was a town hall effort, and each of you who had a chance, we had a chance to talk to, contributed significantly to that, and we thank you for that. We are going to go through, I could read the 244-page report. I'm not going to do that. We could try to go over all of the over 100 recommendations. We're not going to do that. But what we hope to do is to give a thumbnail presentation that identifies in groups some of the findings and recommendations in one way. It's not the only way it could be grouped, but groups it in one way, and also as a result of the feedback that we've already received and questions that we've already received, we have framed the PowerPoint in a way so that when we come upon a topic area and a question has been raised by an alder or by a ad hoc committee member, we're going to answer those questions as we go through the presentation. Because I've learned from my work, former work as a trial lawyer, more important what you all want to have addressed and answered than what we think is important, because you obviously have raised that issue as something that is worthy of, that you want to hear more about. So that's how we sort of have framed our presentation. We also expect and certainly will be here to answer any questions that you all may have as a result of either this presentation, the report itself, or any dialogue that we have this evening. So that's what we intend to do. We intend to try and be as responsive to the questions that have been raised and any comments and thoughts that you all might have at this meeting, rather than just regurgitate the report one more time. I also wanted to say that I'm going to start off the discussion, but I have fortunate to have with me my colleagues who, the three of us did not complete all of the report. We relied on some consultants that are part of our team, depending on the subject material. But to the degree that there is a typo, it's our fault. So it's the three of us that are responsible for the writing of the report. Stephen Connolly to my immediate left and Julie Rulin to my far left. And you'll be hearing from them as we go through the presentation. As indicated, last month we submitted our report, as Christian has indicated, the report was submitted within a couple hours of the ad hoc meeting. The report was completed within 3 hours of the ad hoc meeting, so that's one of the reasons the report was submitted within 2 hours of the ad hoc meeting. So it was a dynamic work in progress with a lot of late nights towards the end, but we got it done. The report includes 146 recommendations and is intended to respond to the RFP that Mr. Udisi indicated and talked about. And as we've said before to the ad hoc committee, the RFP, the degree of detail in the RFP, and the expectations that the RFP asked us to look into provided us a roadmap as to what was the interest of having us look at, and it got us started in a very helpful way with regard to formulating our report and starting our discovery process, if you will. Of course, there's more to be done. As indicated, the police department is working on a response to the findings and recommendations, and you will be hearing from the department publicly. We'll be very interested, obviously, to see how the department responds. Probably be important to say here what we've said before, but not in this forum, because this is the first time we've had a chance to be in this forum, that when we first got started, and from our very first trip all the way through our site visits, we received nothing but complete cooperation from the department, from its command staff, and all the way down to the patrol officers. Everyone that we thought would be helpful to talk to within the department, we were able to talk to. Any document that we asked for, including very sensitive and confidential documents, we were able to access. And we spent a lot of backing and forthing, and it took a lot of resources on behalf of the department in order for us to get the information we needed to be effective and to do our work. We weren't surprised by that. MPD has a reputation, and in particular, folks like Captain Wheeler and Captain Schaaf, as our liaisons, were extremely helpful in getting us the materials that we asked for. As indicated, there will be more to this process. The ad hoc committee intends to continue to meet, to consider our recommendations, to perhaps add additional recommendations or refine our recommendations or what have you. And we look forward to seeing how that process unwinds as well. There are obviously other stakeholders that will be involved in this process. But to the degree that the city, the department, and others agree that a recommendation is sound, then there will be obviously an important implementation phase. We'll talk more about that in our presentation, but quite frankly, in our experience doing this work for the past 15 years, it's the implementation phase where the heavy lifting really begins. While our work took a lot of time and resources to get there, getting things done and moving things forward is even more difficult, because not only does there need to be acceptance of the recommendation, there often needs to be a training component, and then there needs to be assurances that, in fact, that recommendation has taken hold within the organization. That being said, we feel strongly that our recommendations are attainable, that I think they're consistent with what we hear the community of Madison and stakeholders and even members within the MPD organization as well think would help benefit the department on a going forward basis. Most of the changes, and we'll talk more about this as a result of a question that we received, most of the recommendations are relatively resource neutral. There are some that would require an expenditure, and to the degree that that there are ones that do require, would require an outlay. We'll be talking about that as well. We received a couple questions that I think sort of frames the presentation, or will frame the presentation, and what will flow from these questions is essentially capturing the remainder of our report. Mr. Udisi asked us to talk about the most pressing issues facing the Madison Police Department and the recommendations deserving the highest priority. Mr. Sierra asked about the recommendations with regard to which ones might be prioritized, which ones might be an easier lift than others, and any recommendations that are more difficult to do and may take more time to accomplish. With regard to the first question, we see that, and this comes from really our outreach, both within the Madison Police Department, but as significantly and more significantly outside the Madison Police Department, as three areas that the community at least identified to us as the pressing issues facing the Madison Police Department. And we can take 244 pages and boil it down to three. The three that we would list are: one, the concern about racial disparity issues that transcend the police department, and were evidenced by, I think, first evidenced by the Dane County, by the Race to Equity report that encompassed all of Dane County. And so that was one of the issues that were certainly identified. And then the second has to do with critical incidents. What we define as critical incidents are uses of force, uses of deadly force, or uses of significant force, and concern about how that is done internally, what kind of information is being pushed out externally by the police department. And that would be the second bucket of issues that were identified to us as concerning to folks that we talked to. And then the third one is independent oversight, which we'll be talking more about in a little bit, but to frame the issue initially, independent oversight is talking about a supplement to the oversight that has existed in Madison for quite some time. As you all may know, the Police and Fire Commission and the existence of the Police and Fire Commission and the statute that authorized the creation of a Police and Fire Commission has existed since the 19th century and really was a reform-minded legislation statewide that took hold in Madison. And as a result, Madison has had oversight for a lot longer than most parts of the rest of the country. But what we have found, and looking at sort of how oversight has developed throughout the country, is that while the responsibilities and significant responsibilities of oversight that PFC has continues to exist and continues to play a significant role, there are gaps with regard to oversight trends nationally, oversight trends as defined by President Obama's 21st Task Force, where Madison, and not unique to Madison, but virtually every city in the state of Wisconsin, does not have oversight mechanisms that many other larger urban police departments do have. And so our recommendation is intended not to hijack the responsibilities of PFC, but to supplant them not to supplant them, to supplement them in different ways. And we'll talk more about that. So our last recommendation, again, in response to Mr. Udisi's question, our last recommendation is our most important recommendation in our view. You're not going to be in a position where on, a yearly basis or a biannual basis or every 3 years to have a group like us come in and take a look at the Madison Police Department. It's just not efficient to do that. But what would be efficient to do, and what I think would be very helpful to do, is sort of as a handoff, now that our work is drawing to a close, would be to create an independent police auditor. And in our view, the independent police auditor function could and should sort of fill the role that we sort of did by identifying issues and also reporting regularly an unvarnished perspective outside the department about what's going on in the department. And we think that this would be really important. Another role that the independent police auditor could play, and in our view should play, would be to provide an independent check or provide progress reports on the implementation process. So as to the degree that the recommendations are accepted by the ad hoc common council of the department itself, the independent police auditor with boots on the ground on a daily basis with an office here in Madison could provide that role as well, and in our view should. The question that was raised by Alder Skidmore,
how does it interact with the police and fire commission?
is one that I've touched on, but I'll talk a little bit more about, and that how would the independent police auditor interact with the police and fire commission? Police and fire commission has a very important role, one of their most important roles, and what is relatively unique to Madison, to the state of Wisconsin, that is relatively unique to the country, is the fact that PFC has a large responsibility and unfettered discretion on deciding when there is a vacancy who the next chief of police of this city should be. That role, in our view, should continue. We have some ideas about ways to maybe improve that responsibility by soliciting other kinds of public input during their process, but ultimately state statute requires that ultimately the decision on who the next chief will be should be with them. But we also think that there are other things that a police auditor, oh, by the way, another important role that PFC has to do with approving promotions. And so when there is a request that an individual be considered for promotion before the department can actually implement that promotion, it has to go to the PFC and make a case for that promotion. So that's another important oversight role that we think PFC has and we think should continue to have. But the police auditor can, we think, enhance a degree of independent police oversight in the following areas: by receiving public complaints. Mpd has a way to receive complaints, but some community members that we've talked to, we, in our view, would feel more comfortable maybe going directly to a police auditor as opposed to going within the department. There is a mechanism for PFC to receive complaints, although that is a bulky sort of process for those of you who know anything about the PFC. We also think that another thing that could be done is for the police auditor to do sort of systemic audits, whether it's looking at hiring processes, training, any kind of performance audit that one could think of, an independent police auditor with access to information could also do. And also to be sort of at the front line recommending systemic and policy reform in the police auditor's work as they come across issues that are impacting the department. Oftentimes, police auditors that we have worked with have a responsibility to roll out to critical incidents like deadly force incidents, so that the police auditor got boots on the ground. If there's a shooting at 2 in the morning, at 2:15, that auditor is called, and that there is a presence outside of the department to sort of begin to learn what the issues are and begin as an independent auditor to try and identify issues to talk with the department about as they arise. we have talked, and we'll talk more about this critical incident review or shooting review that we think is an important component of our recommendations. And we think the auditor, as an independent voice, should be playing a very important and active role in that process. The auditor also, and we'll be talking a little bit, especially as responding to questions about the disciplinary system and the internal affairs system in Madison, and to be effective, to have an effective outside voice or perspective on that process, a boots on the ground, 24/7 auditor that is reviewing these cases in real time and offering independent recommendations on the quality of the investigation, the objectiveness of the investigation, and outcomes consistent with the department's disciplinary matrix is really important. And then finally, public reporting. The transparency piece is obviously critical. There was a question raised by President Unice about how much this would cost, and this is, again, of all of our recommendations, this is the biggest outlay of cost probably, but we think that a program, an effective, robust program, could get going or get started for about $200,000 or so a year. And that we base that on the size of the department, what we expect the auditor to be doing, and the cost of living in Wisconsin versus California.
So before we move on, I just want to expand a little bit on this before we leave this topic. And good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Conley. I'm very happy to be here and appreciative of your time coming out tonight. One of the components of the model for oversight that we propose, the independent auditor is a big piece of it substantively and mechanically, as far as sort of a full-time person as we envision it, working on these issues and with some background and expertise. A second prong of that, though, is a civilian review board component. And part of Alder Skidmore's question relating to this topic had to do with the importance of creating, if such a board would be created, to have it be independent and unbiased, that is representative of all of Madison's citizens and neighborhoods. And certainly that is the kind of contribution that we envision. The idea of this second piece of it is to have, it's wonderful to have a professional with some expertise and the ability on a full-time basis to be involved in these things. But a critical part of it, especially in a place like Madison, where the level of engagement and interest is so high and the community is so diverse and has so many different perspectives, is that auditor is in a kind of relationship and sort of accountable to a group of actual residents who are in the neighborhoods and experiencing these things and bringing the perspective of themselves and some of the different folks that they might be representing to this process, and making sure that a lot of different voices are heard. So the devil is in the details as far as how the mechanics of that would be done, but there are other jurisdictions, other places that have set up something comparable to what we're, the broad outlines of what we're proposing for Madison. And we talked about Denver being the example that probably comes closest to what we have in mind. But obviously, one thing we've learned in being around the city for years, that you folks are not shy about process, and that you will probably have ideas of your own about how best to accomplish this. But the idea of that citizen, resident, civilian piece is extremely important to making it work in Madison. Compared to other places. And secondly, absolutely, it should be an independent, unbiased group that is representative of the city as a whole.
The same is true with regard to the auditor selection. That will be a critical piece if, in fact, the auditor position is accepted as a recommendation deserving of implementation. Who that person is going to be critical. And one of the questions that was raised by Professor Finley had to do with how do you ensure that the auditor isn't co-opted or become too close with the police if they're working with the police on a day-to-day basis. And that is an ironic paradigm, because in order for the auditor to be effective, the auditor will be needing to be working on a day-to-day basis with police materials, interacting with police command staff and decision makers. And there can, if the auditor isn't careful and if it isn't the right person, there can be too close a connection between the department and the auditor that needs to be carefully watched. That's why the reporting is important. That's why the connection to a community-based board is important, so that distance, at least with regard to no co-option, doesn't occur. The other thing, though, is if there's too much distance and no access to information, then the auditor really can't be effective in her or his role. So it has to be an important balance, and that balance, I know has been struck in other communities where the auditor is continued to be seen, like in Denver, as an independent broker that's providing a lot of transparency, yet having a significant impact on the police department as it goes forward. It can be done. We don't need to belabor our process, but we were out here, I think it's now 8 times. We looked at a number, thousands and thousands of pages of documents in order to do our work. And as I indicated earlier, we had great cooperation and access from the police department, as well as cooperation from all that we reached out to. I'll ask Steve to talk a little bit more about our citizen outreach in response to Alder Skidmore's question. But one of the things we are proud of to be able to say is that, and people did find us, but to the degree that people found us, there wasn't one person who wanted to talk to us that we didn't talk to. We were able to get that done, and we're proud of that. There was a question about civilian MPD personnel that I'll turn over to you, Julie, and then if you want to elaborate on the citizen outreach, Steve.
Hi, good evening, my turn. Julie Rulin, like these guys, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming out on a, questionable weather night. We got a question, so this is, hopefully we're going to try to get this to move smoothly. We're trying to weave these questions into our presentation. Hopefully it doesn't get too clunky, so we're going to give this a shot. But we got a question from Alder Badar about our outreach specifically to civilian staff members of MPD. And we certainly did talk to a number of civilian employees at various levels. One thing that's a little bit unique and commendable with MPD is that there are a number of positions that had been formerly held by sworn staff that they have civilianized in recognition that there are jobs that you don't need a sworn a police officer to do, that civilians can do probably better in certain data functions and technology functions, that you're better off looking outside the world of law enforcement. And there are a bunch of those people in MPD, and that is a kind of progressive move and something that some agencies don't want to do. So I wanted to mention that, including there are a couple of very high-level, sort of captain-level civilian employees within MPD. We spoke with those people. We spoke with civilian employees at all various levels. They have an important perspective because they're not sworn. They haven't been sort of raised up as cops within the organization. They have a different perspective that was important to our work. They also often have an historical perspective that's a little different. Sworn staff moves around a lot. They're jumping and they're promoting. They're going to different districts, different assignments throughout their career. And civilian employees tend to kind of stay in the same place. They might move up. So they can provide an important historical perspective as well. So it was certainly, we appreciated their availability to us and the time they spent with us, and their perspective certainly informed our findings and recommendations, but weren't inconsistent with what were hearing from the sworn staff. It's not like there's a schism between sworn and civilian that we identified. So the answer is yes, and those perspectives were very important, an important part of our review.
excuse me. So in terms of the question about how we arrived at some of our decision-making and how we met the people that we ended up meeting, I'll say a couple things. First of all, we found our status as outsiders and as people who were very much new to Madison obviously to be a disadvantage in some respects. We didn't have the right clothes a lot of the time was certainly an example of that. But more specifically, it's like we're coming in cold, and so we really needed some assistance in terms of finding our way and figuring out how to get started. And that it was an advantage to us in the sense that we didn't have a lot of preconceptions, and we were able to come in and really try to form our own opinions. But we certainly needed a head start, and we had two groups that we relied on very much in terms of getting us started. And those were the committee members, the ad hoc committee members, and then the alders themselves. We had the chance to meet with most of the alders and saw the ad hoc committee folks on a number of occasions. And individually as well as collectively, and got some suggestions from those sources that were a great jumping off point for us. So the point of the ad hoc committee and obviously the alders and the district system here in Madison is that there is a wide range of representation. We were very open to meeting anybody who wanted to meet us. We got a lot of emails. We had a lot of people contacting us. We got invited to a lot of informal events and more formal town hall-y kind of events. And so we really started to develop a certain familiarity so that we were recognizing a lot of the same names and felt pretty confident about the extent to which we were kind of taking the temperature of the city in a balanced way. But absolutely, we relied a lot on the folks in this room for much of that. So thank you.
You know you're starting to get a sense for the community when you don't have to rely on Google Maps to get to someplace. So that was starting to kick in towards the end of our site visits. I think this is you, Stephen.
Okay, that was a short break for you folks, but here I am back. I want to apologize in advance, particularly the ad hoc committee members who have heard me go through this spiel probably 13 times now, but I'm just going to kind of go through it one more time. I hope it came through in the report as well for those of you who have read that and spent some time with it, but we were trying, in terms of wrapping our arms around the mass of information that we were sort of responsible for sifting through and the massive impressions and recommendations that resulted. There were a couple of key themes that sort of linked together a lot of the different aspects of our findings and informed our recommendations. The first of them has to do with the fact that we have a high regard for the Madison Police Department, and we want to be clear about that. There are many, many excellent qualities about the department in terms of its programs, its practices, the things that it does. It's a progressive agency in a lot of ways. And we were very, very impressed by a lot of the personnel that we met and the talent and commitment and dedication that those folks have. So all of that is obviously to the good. The opposition to that, if you will, or the tension on the other side is that we saw, and I think it's a little bit of a related phenomenon. Because the department does so many things so well, and because it is so conscientious about being on top of things, there can be what we perceived was a little bit of a resistance to criticism at times, almost like an indignation at times when the department was challenged or other ways of approaching things or doing it differently or better were raised, and some gaps in self-critique. And some of our concrete recommendations in that regard have to do with some internal review processes that we think could stand to be more robust in terms of the analysis that just routinely goes on in the aftermath of certain things like critical incidents. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Alder Skidmore had a question about one of the things that we said about along these lines with the whole sensitivity to criticism, and we talk about the flashes of frustration and resentment that sometimes have a public face that can be an issue. And we were aware of some of those dynamics that occurred before we arrived in terms of some of the high-profile events and some of the issues that the city was dealing with before our arrival and as a precursor to the creation of our work. But I will also say that we absolutely did work to verify that, if you will, in terms of the various people that we talked to and just the impressions that people had. And we heard about this from a variety of sources, both more public officials, but also private citizens that had different experiences themselves. It wasn't certainly just, opinions and hearsay of people who hadn't had dealings with the department at the highest levels themselves. And what I will say is that our sense is that some of those dynamics, again, have a positive and a negative to it. There's a lot of passion at the highest levels of the department. And there's a strong amount of dedication, I would say, to the city, and a strong dedication to the department itself, and a regard for the work that the police officers are doing out there and the challenges involved. And all of that is great. But that passion, we saw instances and heard about instances and are aware of instances in which that could sometimes shift into an adversarial mode that didn't end up being particularly constructive in our view. And it doesn't necessarily change people's minds, and it has a tendency to truncate conversation. Is what we found in ways that aren't necessarily beneficial or productive. So I hope that's responsive to the question. The second component to the key themes of our report is this idea of are we who we say we are? And that's a phrase that we heard from within the department on a number of occasions throughout our year of working on the study. And again, that has a positive dimension to it. The department does a lot of wonderful things, and its mission statement, its philosophies, the programs it can point to, there's so many impressive, forward-thinking, wonderful things, and all of that is great. But that's a great start, and then the test becomes, is that the reality that people are experiencing? And I think to some extent it is, but there are also some gaps, and also ways that people sometimes feel like the ideals are not being felt by individual officers within the department, particularly those who might come from a non-traditional background as far as law enforcement is concerned, and certainly in terms of the community dynamics themselves. So those are two of the themes. Alder Kimball had a couple of questions in that regard, having to do with Mpd culture. So I want to touch on those while we're at this part of the presentation. The question really had to do with whether the larger dynamics of the department's, the positive larger dynamics of the department's culture, whether we found that to be empty rhetoric. And the answer to that question would be no. It's not empty rhetoric. I think there is a genuine sincerity that we were impressed by. But that doesn't mean that it's always translating into the day-to-day realities, and that's pretty much true in every arena. Your highest principles and your best ideals are sometimes hard to carry out on a daily basis. So I certainly wouldn't say it's lip service or empty rhetoric or it's meant insincerely at all, but absolutely there's room for some self-evaluation and some constant monitoring of these kinds of issues to make sure that the mission statements and the philosophies and the things that are great on paper are being experienced by the officers and by the city as a whole. And then there's another question from Alder Kimball having to do with Mpd, again, with Mpd culture and the experience of officers, African-American officers in particular, we noticed, but officers of color and officers from again, non-traditional law enforcement backgrounds. And Mike, I'm going to turn that over to you.
All right. We did talk to a number of officers of color, and to the degree that MPD compares and stacks up to other agencies that we worked with, other agencies throughout the country. Their numbers, their diversity numbers are higher than the normal police agency throughout this country. In particular, the numbers with regard to gender, the percentage of female officers is one of the highest that we have seen in the country. So there is this striving for diversity in the hiring process, and it is reflected in the numbers themselves. That being said, a number of officers of color that we did talk to who are either with the department, continue to be with the department, who have left the department that we ended up talking to, did sort of express to us this disconnect between the stated ideals of the organization coming down through the SOPs and through the posters and the flyers, if you will, and what's going on the ground. So officers would come to work and think that they were engaging in problem solving and community-based policing, in dynamics that were outside the traditional policing arena, yet would, when engaged in such activity, as they informed us, would get pushback from colleagues, people who had been there longer, about that work, suggesting that to the degree that these principles are being stated at the highest level, whether those are actually sinking in is a question. And that really goes back to one of our biggest questions with regard to data collection. And we'll be talking a little bit about it, more about it, but I should say that here. And that is, there is a gap with regard to whether the ideals of the organization, for example, the chief has indicated that his intent is that the officers on patrol spend 50% of their time engaged in non-traditional policing, engaged in not jumping to calls for service, not involved in citations and arrests and enforcement, traditional enforcement, but doing other things that are more problem-solving, community-basing, engagement with the community. But while that ideal, we support that ideal, and we think that's a great ideal, and we don't think that that percentage is unattainable. But what we also don't know, because it doesn't exist, is to the degree that that ideal is being promulgated, the degree that that's really going on in a patrol setting on a day-to-day basis by patrol officers in the various districts. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we talk a lot about in our reports about the reasons for it. But the big reason is that there has not been a successful way to capture that activity. The ironic thing is that traditional policing activity is captured very easily, because when you arrest somebody, when you cite somebody, there's a paper trail that you need to prepare to support that activity. And so it's very easy by going in a database and pushing a number to learn how many times Officer Smith has arrested and has engaged in arrests over the past 6 months. It's impossible currently for the department to push a button and see how many times Officer Smith has engaged in problem solving, de-escalation, engagement, because unless you ask or expect the officers to document that activity, it won't be documented. And so one of our recommendations is to come up with a way to document that information so that everyone has a better understanding, both internally and then externally, about what police officers are doing on a day-to-day basis. And that's true in so many different rubrics that we looked at, that piece seems to be missing from the dialogue, both internally and externally. I'll give you just one more example. As a result of a recommendation from Common Council, there has been much more effort to produce on a day-to-day basis information about what officers are doing. And you all get those, you get those emails. But if you look at what is being reported, virtually all of it, I might even say all of it, is crime-fighting traditional activity. Those blogs do not contain information about problem-solving, engagement, and the like. And one of our key recommendations is to reshift that paradigm so that information is being pushed out to the community as well. This is organizationally another way to sort of look at our report, and you can read itself, but these are just a way to sort of frame the rest of our presentation. Why don't you go, Steve?
Okay, so yeah, that previous slide about the recommendations, you'll be seeing that one a lot, because there are so many recommendations. We just wanted to find a way to kind of orient the presentation a little bit and give you some familiar ground to slip back on. So we're going to go through each of these 5 categories. There's all kinds of ways that people can group the recommendations together to make it a little bit more of a manageable thing, and it all depends on what your focus is. But these are just 5, and there's nothing magical about the 5 that we're going to be relying on today, but it is as just basically a way to kind of group some of the concepts together and make it a little bit more manageable, and again, be responsive to the specific questions that we received in preparation for tonight. So the first one had to do with recommendations relating to effective MPD practices. So basically the point, a lot of the point for these recommendations, and there are several of them, is that we are seeing some good things here, and we wanted to both affirm that, reinforce that, and also encourage the department to find ways either to get back to those if there had been some slippage or just some gaps in focus, if you will. And again, to acknowledge that they are worth pursuing on a going forward basis. And some of these absolutely have to do with collaborative programs to address systemic inequality, inequity. A lot of the department's, let's put it this way, the department is very attuned to the issues of racial inequity that have been talked about in Madison for a long time, and that have been a focal point. We learned a lot from the 2013 Race to Equity report and some of those findings and the implications of those. And the department, we have the sense that the department very much gets that. And they are active participants in a variety of programs that are meant to find ways to get at it. And one of them had to do, we talked a lot about and heard a lot about restorative justice programs and a lot of alternatives to the traditional justice system when it came to kind of low-level offenders. One of these was the municipal court diversion program that was for juveniles. Again, infraction-level offenses, and it's about finding them a way to address those issues and be held accountable in a way that wouldn't necessarily have an impact on their future or thwart their future in any way. The department is an active participant in that, and one of the things that we heard from a variety of sources, and there's a restorative court concept, there's a truancy court concept in the schools that Judge Koval has been very much interested in and an active participant and facilitator of. And there's also a 17 to 25-year-old Dane County restorative court concept, which all 3 of those programs are very innovative, really good stuff, and there's a lot of people that are working on multiple versions of that. Alder Kemble had a question about the demographics, and I think Chief Findley from the ad hoc committee also had a similar question about another one of the programs. We do, there are these programs absolutely are tracking the data as far as how it is working in the numbers of people who are going through the program and the backgrounds of those folks. And I have something, I brought a hard copy with me, and I'm happy to make sure that you get it. I looked for it online, but one of the people I met from the Dane County Children's side provided me with a hard copy of it, and that's what we were relying on, but we will make sure that you get a copy of that as well. And Keith, I'm going to get you some horsepower on the older version. But the program is effective. It is basically the demographics are tracking pretty much the overall arrest statistics in terms of the number of people who are involved. And to the extent that this is providing a way for people to avoid running into the collateral consequences of these low-level offenses and having that really put them behind the 8 ball in a lot of different ways, these programs have been very successful, and I think that there's a lot of value in continuing to support and pursue them. In terms of the history of problem-oriented and community policing initiatives, this is another big theme of MPD's policing philosophy that, again, we are very supportive of. We think it, and Madison and the Madison Police Department were very much sort of national innovators in this regard, going back to the days of Herman Goldstein and really the 80s. And we had the opportunity to meet with Herman Goldstein, Professor Goldstein. He was fascinating to listen to and had some great perspectives for us, and just to kind of meet him, we were familiar with some of his very influential works in this area, just talking about the theories behind it. We think problem-oriented and community policing are very positive things, and to the extent that MPD is committed to them, we are very supportive of that. Alder Kemble had a specific question about the CORE team, which is a relatively new program that relies on federal grant money, but it is a small group, a cadre of officers. I think it's a sergeant and 4 officers whose assignment basically is focused exclusively on these kind of community-oriented outreach activities, and their special focus is on middle school age students. And the question really had to do with, does it go beyond public relations, and is there any substance there? Our sense is that, obviously a lot of the positive surface level community interactions, the barbecues and parties and basketball games and those kinds of things that allow people to be familiar with the police in a different way and help foster positive relationships, those things are great. But ideally, that's just going to be a component of a community policing philosophy. And the core team is very much interested in working with middle schoolers in a substantive way, to talk to them about their options, to talk to them about some of the different issues in the justice system and in Madison in general, and very much interested in procedural justice in terms of really trying to educate folks on why things happen in a particular way, get them to understand it, and hopefully, they're getting some feedback from the young people as well. So we were impressed with the core team and their enthusiasm and commitment. They've only been at it in earnest for less than a year. I think the program began with 1 person and it expanded back in May or June of 2017. So it's a new colt, wobbling on its legs in some ways, and I think there's room for it to strengthen its game and get more focused on what it can be doing and should be doing, but we think the program is a positive one. I don't know if you have anything you want to add there.
I do. Where do we go next, though?
Oh.
We kind of, you hit on that all sort of earlier.
No. But I'm just wondering where we're going next. Okay. I think this is mine anyway. So I would just codicil to 2 things that Stephen said. One is that the core team, as there have been other teams that we've seen come and go in MPD over the time that we've been here, is, as Steve indicated, is being funded largely by a federal grant. And that's the problem with federal grants, is that they exist today and they don't exist tomorrow or next year or the year after that. And so to the degree that there's this degree of continuity, the federal government giveth and taketh away, and that is always an issue with regard to federal grants. And I know Common Council is obviously involved in some of that decision making and cognizant of the push-pull there and that dynamic. The other thing that is sort of the overarching question, and this really goes back to recommendation 1, which is also a key recommendation of ours, and that is this. The countercurrent or the counter dialogue or the contrasting dialogue that we have heard repeatedly from members of the Madison community is this, and that is this kind of stuff that core team is doing, the other kinds of outreach that the police department is doing, the non-traditional policing that is going on with the specialized units. The question, the overarching question that we heard from a number of individuals is a police officer or a police agency best situated to address these issues? Or is there another entity that could address it as effectively or even more effectively? That's an interesting thing that really goes down to the basic, what it is that this city wants its policing to look like. What is it that this city wants its police department to be doing? The way in which that question has been answered in the country has a lot to do with the strategic plan that a police department puts together on a regular basis. Unfortunately, and this is not specific to Madison, but unfortunately, policing in America is often reacting to crises. There's an incident, a series of crimes, there's this and that, and so because the policing has a 24/7 responsibility, they're jumping and reacting to this. More progressive agencies, consistent with, again, the task force recommendations of President Obama, are getting more thoughtful and reflective in trying to take time away from their busy day to plan what the future of policing looks like for the agency. And even before we got here, there was already a consultant that was retained, et cetera, to try and assist MPD with developing a strategic plan, because they don't have one currently, right? And so, to the credit of the department kind of waited until our review was done. And what we've heard is that some of the recommendations or the degree that we provide insight in our report could be used for them as they come up with a strategic plan. But going back to my original point is consistent with progressive philosophies now is the recognition that the police shouldn't be developing a strategic plan on their own. So the kinds of questions that I have just raised, that one question, is something that should be talked about. There should be community input. There should be involvement to answer those kinds of questions. Because really the project should be looking at what MPD, not what MPD is doing now, but what MPD would be doing 5 years from now. And without community involvement, particularly in a community like this, whatever the department comes up with will be hollow and will be insular. So it's important and critical, and that's why we recommend, as recommendation number one, that this be an important piece where there's engagement in the community. All right. Related to that is the outreach. Community engagement is really a critical piece. You'll see numerous recommendations in which we promote the idea of community engagement. Again, this is historical, but traditionally in the United States, police agencies have largely decided the rules in which its officers operate, the policies, the procedures, the protocols, the priorities of policing has largely been decided by the police agency itself, with not a lot of input from a community, from outsiders, from people outside the organization. The trend in progressive policing in America is to move away from that model and to find ways to engage the community in each of these decisions. Therefore, our recommendations with regard to standard operating procedures, that instead of the department sort of figuring out we need to improve policy here, we need to provide more guidance to our officers with regard to this particular concept, that no longer should be done as a strictly MPD responsibility. In our view, before those policies are devised, implemented, and accepted, and by the way, MPD does a very good job of roundtabling those policies within the organization, but in our view, there is an another important concept, and that is to allow the opportunity of the public and the community to respond to those policy changes before they're adopted. And that's just one example of a whole series of things that we ask for more engagement in. Go ahead if you want to talk.
Are you still up here?
I'm done with that.
Okay. So the dynamic Mike is describing is there's a continuum, obviously, from kind of an old school, the police will tell you what they're doing and you will like it mentality, which would be way over here. The other kind of end of that spectrum is where people talk, or at the other end of that spectrum is the concept of community control of the police. That's some of the concepts that Mike is talking about, kind of pushed to the nth degree. And community control of the police is a term of art, really. And M. Adams of Freedom Inc. wrote a very detailed explanation of how that would work in Madison and why it should work in Madison. And we had the opportunity to meet with her and appreciated her perspective very much. We don't advocate community control of the police, which basically is saying, hey, each neighborhood essentially would be responsible with a budget from within, with its own residents and leaders and people who are best situated to know how to solve problems. Those people would be in charge of deciding what form of policing, or if there would be a form of policing, to address the particular issues in their neighborhood. There are some mechanical challenges with that. And we, again, the concept of community control of the police is something that you hear a lot about. That's not particularly what we are advocating, or not at all what we're advocating, except to the extent that it reflects a mentality that Mike was talking about here of the community engagement and the genuine involvement of the community and influence of the community on what the police are doing. And the Captain's Advisory Group is a very good, kind of modest start to that. It was in the South District. It was a pilot program, again, with some federal grant money. But the captain there was basically saying, hey, I think we could be doing this better, and let me get some people who are actually living here and experiencing these things and having their ideas and seeing if they would be willing to participate and guide. And took a lot of initiative, and again, I think Captain Patterson would tell you it was very modest and just kind of getting started, but the instinct and the initiative is a very good one, and the more that those kinds of things can be reinforced, I think the better. Okay, the next, this is kind of more of the same, and you can see the multiple recommendations relating to this idea of involving the public more. And we really feel like it's not just kind of a pie in the sky idea. There are some very specific, concrete ways, and even some relatively small but potentially influential ways that could be done. A lot of it's just a mindset and a way of approaching the issues. Oops. So here, this should make people feel better. We're going to fly through this slide. It's the same slide again. So we're moving to a new category, and this has to do with efforts to strengthen MPD's internal review mechanisms. We talked at the beginning of our presentation about one of the areas that we thought could use some work is the whole idea of self-scrutiny and how the department looks at things that it has done, not necessarily in a disciplinary accountability sort of way, although that's a component of internal review, but also to look for lessons learned, to look for ways it could have been done differently or better. And I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
All right.
Or Mike.
I'm happy to do whatever.
Oh, this is you. Go ahead.
This is me. So, yeah. A lot of this, the internal review mechanisms have to do with how the department responds to critical incidents and other uses of force. And I just want to say, just as from the outset, our orientation is very much about along with the authority to use force, to use deadly force, and other force on individuals in the community comes a very high responsibility. And our orientation is very much about looking for ways to minimize those uses of force, minimize the degree of force used. And so pretty much all of these recommendations about the internal review mechanisms come from that premise of how can we, there's force that is legally justified, but perhaps not entirely necessary. And so all of our focus is on how do you minimize those uses of force in that sort of category. And and there's sort of two aspects of that. And this first slide has to do with how the department engages with the community, again, in this theme of community engagement after one of these critical incidents. And we have some specific recommendations about that, but it really all boils down to this last point about the department's willingness to get out there and discuss the incident and to admit those times when perhaps things could have gone differently, things could go better. And that is a key piece of their response to these critical incidents. But going sort of moving from that to the internal review and how the department views these things internally, the ad hoc committee has heard us talk a lot about critical incident review and how this is really a key piece of our recommendations and our focus about how important it is for the department that, again, talking about that responsibility that goes along with the authority to use force, the responsibility to learn all that you can about the incident and to learn how you can make changes to the agency moving forward. And so we have a lot of specific recommendations about these sort of internal review mechanisms, but we also got a number of specific questions. So I'm going to try to tackle the questions. And the first was from Alder Kimball, her question 3 about the process for doing administrative reviews. So when a shooting happens, other critical incident, significant use of force, there's a criminal investigation that here in Madison is conducted by DCI, the Department of Justice's Criminal Investigations Branch. And so that happens first, and then there's, following on that, there's an administrative review. And historically, and in most cases that we looked at, the department's administrative review is sort of a repackaging of the investigation that had been done on the criminal side. We saw a couple of cases where there was some investigative work done on the administrative side, but there wasn't. The question from Alder Kimball was whether there was some sort of shift in policy or a different time frame, and the answer is no. As you know, sometimes you see a little administrative work done or investigative work done, but most often you didn't. And this wasn't any kind of formal shift in a policy or a certain time frame for that. The real thrust of our recommendations, and a key component of all of our recommendations, is that this internal review process needs to be routine and automatic. It's something that happens regardless. So like we have seen, sometimes there's some administrative investigations, most often there's not. What we think is really important is that administrative investigation becomes a standard, part of the department's standard process. The criminal investigation's done, and the criminal investigation focuses on a very narrow question of, were the officer's actions, should the officer be held criminally liable for his or her actions? And that investigation looks at that question, but there are going back to this point of, could the force have been avoided? There are so many other questions that you can ask and that we feel an administrative investigation should ask in terms of, the tactics leading up to the use of force, the training involved, equipment issues. There are a host of questions that we address in our specific recommendations. we have some other,
The delay,
what's that?
delay.
The delay, right. Alder Zellers asked a question about the delay that's created. So you've got this criminal review, and then you're going to do an administrative review. And the timing of all of it gets a little bit tricky because DCI is in charge of the criminal, in shootings in which somebody's hit by an officer's bullet. DCI is in charge of that, and just fatals. DCI is in charge of that investigation. And so the department, the typical way to do it is you wait till the criminal investigation is done, and that creates a delay before the officer will be interviewed by the department's, internal affairs investigators or the administrative piece of it. That delay is less problematic if a very good interview has been done in a timely way by the criminal investigation. And that's, this issue gets a little bit complicated because the DCI investigative protocols actually give officers several days before they have to be interviewed before the criminal investigator will even attempt to interview the officers who are involved in a shooting. We don't believe that that is consistent with best practices for investigations, and think that the better practice would be to interview officers the night of an incident while their memories are fresh, before there is an opportunity for them to view media reports, talk to others, and just have their memories become potentially contaminated by these outside sources. We think it's that best practice. So we're in sort of disagreement with the DCI protocols on that, but the DCI protocols are what they are. That's not something MPD has control over. And your question, Alder Zellers, was about whether there's an approach. I think this was the question, was whether there's an approach to help ameliorate that issue with the time delay. And one approach could be for MPD to compel an administrative interview on the night of a shooting. That's certainly one approach that could be explored with that. Go to the next slide. I got this one too. This is, again, just sort of following up. This next slide has to do with uses of force that are not deadly force. And again, the ad hoc committee has heard us talk about this. MPD has come a long way in the last 2 years in terms of the way it reviews force and tracks force data and is paying attention to these non-deadly force incidents. There's a use of force coordinator. It's been a moving target through the year that we've been working here, that we've been closely following and tracking. We believe there's still some room for further improvement in terms of how the level of attention that supervisors are giving to use of force incidents, how those incidents are being investigated, the kind of investigative work that's done after each force incident. And then we have some recommendations about creating, for certain categories of force, a roundtable that looks at, again, similar to the themes of of the critical incident review, that looks at equipment issues, that looks at training, that looks at policies, procedures, and takes a more holistic approach to the force to see what can be learned. And again, the idea that this would be a sort of standard process. It would be routine, and with the notion that even when there is nothing sort of wrong with the force, there are things you can learn, even if it's just about reinforcing the good things that the officers did in that incident. Alder Zellers had some other questions, and I'm going to try to tackle those as well. There is a question about the discussion of de-escalation policy, and the question is whether that terminology also includes training in sort of preventing the escalation to begin with. And so when we talk about de-escalation, it's become a term of art, certainly in police training, and that term really does apply to those situations and specific training and tools that officers are taught for when they respond to a call that's already escalated, that's already hot. They're going into a fight, and it's about, how can we get out of that? What kind of tools can we use to try to calm the waters, if you will? Or they're being called to, the scene where somebody is intoxicated or suffering some mental health crisis. How can we use our tools? They're often simple verbal communication skills in trying to sort of calm things down. So when we talk de-escalation, it's really about officers approaching situations that are already kind of up here. Your point's a very valid one about what kind of training is there to help officers avoid, escalating things themselves. And that is certainly important training. You don't want officers going into traffic stops and themselves sort of getting everybody worked up. And that is a sort of different kind of training, but again, it's an excellent point, and it's important that the department's also paying attention to that issue. A couple of other very specific questions about our recommendations, and I would just say, question 3 about, there's a footnote that has to do with public input into force policies, and that the reason we don't make a specific recommendation in this section is because we did make that recommendation much earlier in the report, and that was recommendation 10. And then your question 4 about there's some specific language that we suggest in the whole area of this force prevention. How do you prevent uses of force that are perhaps legally justified, but maybe not necessary? And we have some specific language that we cite that we've seen other agencies use, and we make a general recommendation that the MPD consider similar language, though maybe not, it's for MPD to work out the specifics of that language and for the community to work out the specifics of it. But it certainly is our recommendation that language similar to that you referred to in your question be included in MPD policy.
This slide is dedicated entirely to Alder Ahrens, who is very interested. And so I dedicate, what number is this? We don't know. I dedicate slide 28 to Alder Ahrens. He asked questions about data, and I have different answers depending on the data that he's asking about. As I said earlier, the department does a very good job of collecting data with regard to arrests. There are some issues with regard to the federal, as Alder Ahrens himself knows, there are some complexities with regard to categorizing under the federal system and the way in which the department is obligated to report out crime. But that's more of a federal issue than an MPD issue. But they do a pretty good job of categorizing and collecting arrest data. Use of force, if we were having this discussion 5 years ago, we would say that MPD is below industry standards with regard to collecting data about use of force. But as we indicate in our report, again, as a result of a federal grant that hopefully will continue, the department was able to appoint a sergeant as a use of force coordinator and also update some of its database information, and now does a better job, at least consistent with industry standard, with regard to reporting and collecting data on use of force. What we would like to see more of is, as Julie indicated, a more robust review of that force itself, which is a collateral issue. You have the data, but for example, unlike most agencies will require at least a sergeant to make a determination as to whether every use of force is consistent with policy. Under MPD's current process, that requirement doesn't exist. So there's no requirement that a sergeant even look at and make a call as to whether or not that force was consistent with department SOPs. Personnel evaluation, the answer to this one is there is no formal evaluative process. And one of our key recommendations is to reinstitute a formal evaluative process. So the answer to bullet 3, Alder Ahrens, is no. The data isn't great there because officers are not being evaluated in a written or formal way. And then finally, fiscal accounting. We found that consistent with industry standards, didn't see any issues there. And I think going back to Alder Badar's question about civilian staff, I think civilian staff is credited for moving that ball because I think that they are well, in many ways, better equipped to collect that data and push it out. So those are the short answers. And we can have offline if you want to follow up on that, Alder Ahrens. There is a big piece in our report about discipline, and that prompted a number of questions from the alders. And I'm not going to go into detail. We can have offline conversations about it, but certainly all of these issues are relevant. There were issues that we did identify in the discipline system that I do want to mention at least briefly. Alder Kemble had a question about civilian versus sworn staff. We looked at that. There were 23 employees of MPD that were disciplined over the past 21 months. And of those, 16 of them were sworn, 7 were civilians, so there wasn't really a significant imbalance there. But we do have other issues about the discipline system, as we indicate. Did we miss it? Okay, it's not in there. As we went through the discipline, one of the issues, and this was raised by a number of other individuals in discussions with us, has to do with the reticence of taking a significant discipline case over to PFC. One of the issues is, with one exception, there hasn't been a suspension case taken over to PSC in the past 4 or 5 years, which is an interesting fact and not a good one. So in essence, every suspension that the department decided to impose a suspension, which is a significant discipline, all of those actions resulted in a settlement. And the settlement usually consists of the department agreeing to reduce the suspension from 3 days suspension to none, or 3 to 2, or 3 to 1, as part of a deal that is struck with the employee, thereby obviating the need to take a case like that to PFC. What we have heard is that it's so labor intensive and so convoluted and so difficult to present a case to PFC that provides a disincentive from almost everyone to want to take a case. So there are many more cases that are settled. We have a concern about that process. It would be like a criminal justice process in which everyone pleads guilty and no one goes to trial. And while and the whole settlement process we've seen in other agencies that we've been intimately familiar with, is the dynamic is the officer has an interest in settling the case, the department has an interest in settling the case, the lawyers representing the department have an interest in settling the case, but a person who's not at that table in the decision to settle the case is the complainant, is the victim, and they don't really have an involvement there, which is one of the reasons for our recommendation to have an independent auditor sort of be that voice and present and sort of say, wait a minute, this is an unprincipled decision. We shouldn't settle this case. It should be a 5-day suspension. That's consistent with your matrix. And we don't have anyone like that in the current discussion. And we think that there should be somebody like that in that discussion, which is a role that independent police auditor could and should play to have that independent voice in these outcomes. We also, on the discipline system, had some question. Again, an auditor could be best situated, who's actually looking at these cases on a day-to-day basis, but the auditor could play a role in the scoping of the charges. So, for example, if you look at the disciplinary reports, to the credit of the department that they put out publicly and are on their website, if you look at one case, there was a case involving an officer who, according to the narrative, cheated on a test. Yet the way it looks from the disposition is it wasn't handled as an integrity issue. It was handled as a performance issue. So those are the kinds of discussions, and I'm not saying we passed judgment that that was the wrong decision, but it certainly raised a question in our mind, and an auditor who had that access and had that voice could certainly play a role in further fleshing out those kinds of questions. Body cameras, let's try to jam it, but I think we should say something.
Okay, we are thundering down the home stretch, I promise. So thank you for all your patience.
We're going to have 2 hours of questions.
Well, there you go. Okay, maybe fair enough.
We're ready.
I think that's great. One of the issues that has come up a lot in the city over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, in various ways and through various processes, is the issue of whether MPD should adopt a body-worn camera protocol. And we know a lot about body-worn cameras, and we don't mean to be punting on this as, as saying, hey, we don't want to make a decision. Our report is a genuine reflection of our views about body cameras, which is to say, we don't feel like we would advise a particular jurisdiction to say yes or no in any kind of a vacuum. There are a lot of issues relating to body cameras, as Madison has worked through the process in a lot of thoughtful ways. And without belaboring the point, what we would say is that we have worked with agencies that have them, we have worked with agencies that don't and have decided not to, and there are very, very good reasons for taking one road or the other. The thing that we really are trying to emphasize in our report is, if you are going to move forward with it, you should do so with your eyes wide open in terms of what are your expectations. What are you hoping? Why are you doing this? What are you hoping to get out of it? And what do you think will result from implementing the program? Because sometimes there is a gap between the way it plays out and what people are expecting or hoping for when they enthusiastically jump in. So Alder Skidmore, I've talked to him about this topic on a few different occasions. I know that he is a supporter of a pilot program. And if the question is, hey, do we think a pilot program is a good idea? It's really, we can just kind of circle back to the same place. We think pilot programs are a potentially useful thing, but it would only be in the context of a decision-making process that was front-ended in terms of, again, understanding the expectations, understanding what the parameters would be, understanding what the policies would be, and that there was a lot of community input and shared understanding of the details before even a pilot was attempted.
Thank you. And just to riff on that, the reason we focus so much on the policies being done first is we've seen where that hasn't happened, and there has been it's been a disaster. So, for example, in our jurisdiction in Los Angeles, they went with a pilot project, and then they just did a policy sort of surreptitiously without community input, and it became a disaster, and there is no acceptance of body cameras among the community of Los Angeles. That's not the way to go. That's why we recommend that if, in fact, for those who are interested in continuing, that there needs to be a consensus and understanding of what the parameters are going to be with regard to disclosure, retention, usage, all kinds of things, and we list them all in our report. This sort of goes to a question regarding which recommendations are the most feasible, which ones would be the most
Don't forget this one.
difficult. All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But since I'm talking about this other one, and that is outside stakeholders, a number of our recommendations are directed not at MPD. The majority are directed at MPD, but there are others for the city, for the association, that require some work with regard to MOU between the association and the department and the city, to PFC. So there are a number of outside entities that are within the rubric. We think they're important to make the recommendations because they interrelate to what MPD is doing and the work that MPD is doing, but those are going to be the heavier lifts in response to ad hoc committee member Sierra's question. Which ones are going to be the hardest to do? The ones that involving the outside entities are probably going to be the harder to do, because assuming we get an acceptance of an agreement from MPD to implement the recommendation, it's easy for them to do it because it's their deal. They can't do anything about a recommendation we make to the Police and Fire Commission, although Commissioner Finley might have something to be able to do about that. All right, so staffing. There have been a number of questions about staffing, and we understand that staffing is certainly in the minds and the forefront of virtually everyone in this room. We weren't asked to do a staffing study, so our report doesn't talk about a staffing study. A staffing study has been done by an outside consultant, of which all of you are probably very aware of. There's been an internal staffing study that was done by the city, and you all have those. It would have been probably duplicative for us to do another one. We weren't asked to do one, but we do have something to say about staffing, but it really relates to this. And it's indirectly relating to staffing more than directly relating to staffing. We don't have an answer for you on how many officers MPD needs today. What we do have some suggestions about has to do with getting a better understanding of how much work is being, going back to something I said half hour ago or longer, how much MPD is doing with regard to non-traditional policing. Because if in fact there is a commitment, and if in fact the community agrees with that commitment by your police chief to have officers engage in non-traditional policing for 50% of the time, that is necessarily going to require more resources. The problem or the rub for us goes back to what I said a little bit ago, which is we don't know enough to really inform you about whether or not that goal or objective is being done. We don't know, and we're not sure, we don't think MPD knows, whether or not its officers are performing 50% of their time in non-traditional policing functions. So there's two questions to ask, which is, do we want that percentage? Do we agree with that percentage that the chief has committed to? We kind of support it, but you all ought to weigh in on that as well. And then the second question is, if in fact we agree with that level of commitment, is that being done? And show us the data to assure us that that's being done. Okay, home stretch here. We talked about that. We talked about that. You know, we have obviously other things to suggest. And then the last slide is really, again, a question from ad hoc committee member Sierra, which is how do we measure MPD's progress? I think this really speaks to, again, the heavy lift of implementation of any recommendations that are accepted by the city or the department. And I think that's done in two ways. One, I do think it's incumbent upon MPD itself, to the degree that the recommendations are directed in MPD, for them to self-report on progress. But I also think this would be a critical role or a key role for the auditor to do. Somebody who has the ability on a day-to-day basis to learn how the department is going, to review if there's a training component, to sit there and look at the training and to ensure that not only is there lip service to the adoption of the policies, but whether they're playing out in practice in the field. So that's a critical piece. And with that, we are done.